I'm reading the introduction and chapter 1 of Colonization and the Wampanoag story. Introduction. This book is about indigenous history, specifically that of the Wampanoag and other southern New England tribes. It focuses on Wampanoag territory as a point of the first European contact and settlement and the impacts of colonization on the indigenous people of the region. We will look at this history and apply the following definition of racism to it. Racism. 1. A belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. 2a. A doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles. 2b. A political or social system founded on racism. 3. Racial prejudice or discrimination. 4. The systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. This book starts with a story, When Life Was Our Own, which describes Wampanoag life before any European contact. The story was created to relate traditional Wampanoag culture, beliefs, practices, and values based on our oral traditions and research done over many years. There are no written sources of these early times due to the processes of colonization described in the other parts of the book. An understanding of pre-contact life brings clarity to the impacts of colonization on indigenous people. I'm going to go ahead and issue a disclaimer. There are a few tribes that are going to be mentioned here shortly that I may or may not be saying correctly, so I apologize if I pronounce them incorrectly. I am trying to pronounce them phonetically, so hopefully it's close. The book outside of When Life Was Our Own is inclusive of all tribal nations in southern New England: Abenaki, Nipmuc, Pocumtuck, Mohican, Narragansett, Niantic, Pequot, Mohegan, and Wampanoag, as we all share the same colonial experiences. The history sections start in the 1400s with events that occurred before 1620 and proceed chronologically through settlement and colonization to the present day. This book relates history that happened, but which has been omitted or erased or is distorted and stereotyped in history books today. The truth of history should be told because, in this case, it's about the beginnings of America, the foundation America was built on, and the truth should be told, period. You will read a lot of things you've never heard about before, and they're pretty tough things, but this is not about blame or making anyone feel guilty or bad. That's not the purpose of this book. This is about readers gaining an understanding of what actually happened in the past. There are many wrongs in the past, but you can't fix something until you know what it is. We can't change what happened in the past, but we can decide to go forward in a better way where there is equality and equity for all people. While this book focuses on southern New England, the same formula of colonial processes was applied to other tribal nations across the rest of the country as America expanded north, south, and west into their homelands. Chapter 1. When Life Was Our Own, Spring and the Time of the New Year. Greeting the Day. Little Bird felt a slight breeze on her face and the sudden warmth of the morning sun, bidding her to open her eyes to a new day. Her body resisted rousing from the warm furs of the bed. Maybe just one more snuggle before getting up. Just yesterday, her family and many others had moved from the winter home to their summer cornfields. Sachem Corn Tassel, the leader of their village, had Little Bird's family return to the same field they had planted last year. Little Bird was 12 now, and had helped her Grandma Yellow Sky, Grandpa Singing Wolf, and Auntie Blue Heron carry all the bags and baskets that held everything to set up their summer household. There were dishes and cooking utensils, tools for tanning hides, woodworking and stone knapping, axes and hoes for working in the garden, and bags of cordage, string and rope, used for making nets or weaving mats. It was only a mile's walk from the winter village, but it all seemed to get heavier as Little Bird walked along. Her arms felt like she had carried 10 bags instead of only 4. Little Bird finally got one eye open and saw her mom standing just outside the door. Smiling Dove was offering her morning prayers. Little Bird slid out from under the furs and quickly dressed. She went out and took Mom's hand, joining her in giving thanks for another morning. Her dad was standing near the cornfield. Strong Bear faced east toward the ocean, his hand raised with his tobacco offering. Little Bird looked across all the cornfields, which went as far as the eye could see. Everyone's houses were in the middle of their fields, where they could watch over their growing crops. People were coming out of their houses, offering prayers and getting fires started. Little Bird loved this first part of the morning. It was quiet and peaceful, and you could collect your thoughts for the day. The smell of salt air was gently pungent, with only birdsong accenting the tranquil silence. Back toward the winter village, the forest met the edges of the cornfields. The pine trees whispered their greetings as the wind rustled through their thick branches. Little Bird loved the sound of the wind rustling through the pines. She took a moment to just stand and listen. Summer move. Mom and Dad had come a few days earlier to check the frame of the house and make any necessary repairs. They had brought the bulrush and cattail mats that covered the frame so the rest of the family would have a roof over their heads when they arrived. Smiling Dove's field was close to a stream, at a place where the water tumbled down over the rocks like a tiny waterfall. A little pool formed at the bottom of the rocks, and sometimes you could find a bass or perch or trout resting from his travels. It was in a shady spot deep enough to sit on in a hot sunny day, to splash around and wash the dust off from working in the garden. Last summer, when Strawberry, Little Bird's little sister, stood in the pool, the water came up to her neck. This year she was 6 and so much taller. She figured the water would only be up to her chest. Every day more people arrived, setting up and settling in for the summer. There was always so much to do. Some house frames needed repair, some needed to be replaced altogether. Smiling Dove's house was in good shape and didn't need a lot of work. The fields needed to be burned over and the soil turned. There were herring to be caught, planting ceremonies to hold, and corn to set in the earth. When all these things were done, it was time for the New Year's ceremonies on the new moon of the sowing month when corn is planted. Time to eat. After morning prayers, Smiling Dove went back to their storage pit and brought out the rest of the dried food left from last fall. There was still a huge basket of corn for eating, as well as the corn seed. Little Bird and Strawberry helped her carry bags of dried beans, making 2 more trips to get all of the baskets of dried squash and pumpkin, sunflower seeds, blueberries, and cranberries. There was even a small basket of smoked deer meat, maybe enough for a few meals. Mom took everything into the house. She was going to cook inside today, as there was still an edge on the wind. Besides, the arbor over the summer kitchen just outside still needed new sheets of bark on its roof. The old ones were brittle and breaking, and their edges curling up. Smiling Dove stirred the embers of the fire back together, added some kindling, and got a good blaze going again. She took a medium-sized clay kettle, filled it half full of water, and set it on 3 stones next to the main fire, putting 2 handfuls of dried corn into the mortar. She began to crack it with the stone pestle. Strawberry wanted to help, so Mom showed her how to pick the heavy pestle up and drop it on the kernels to break them down into meal. Strawberry had to use both hands to hold the pestle, even though it only had to be lifted a little ways. The mortar was deep enough to keep the corn from bouncing out when the pestle hit it. A very determined and zealous Strawberry, however, lifted the pestle too high. So when it dropped on the corn, kernels flew out, landing on the ground. Smiling Dove and Little Bird knelt and began picking them up. Neither had to say a word to Strawberry. She also started picking up the corn, realizing her mistake. She remembered the times when Grandma, Mom, Blue Heron, and others talked about corn and all food coming from living beings, how corn was a sacred plant to be handled with respect. The flyaway kernels were rinsed off and dried to be used another day. Meanwhile, Mom asked Little Bird to start a fire under the kettle between its tripod of 3 rocks. The sticks and twigs burned into coals in just a few minutes. Little Bird kept feeding the fire, and very soon bubbles began to form on the water. Mom put 3 handfuls of dried beans into the pot. She asked Little Bird to fill another kettle with more water at the spring. It was not far from the house, rippling out of the bank of the stream. By the time she got back, the beans were boiling steadily, and Mom had added some of Strawberry's cracked corn. She tamped the fire down a bit so that the pot would simmer. Strong Bear had made her a new stirring paddle of maple wood, carving a dove at the end of the handle. The girls could see how pleased Mom was with the paddle as she stirred the food, making sure nothing was sticking to the bottom of the kettle. I'm going to show you. There's a picture here. You can see of just kind of a cooking kettle, the stones and the fire underneath. And there's a woman in the back preparing food. It says, ready for a piping hot breakfast on an early spring morning. Strawberry had used all of the strength in her arms to overheft the pestle during her corn pounding lesson. She leaned back on the bed to rest. Her arms felt the way mud pies look when you make them in the rain. She closely watched Smiling Dove, who was grinding more kernels in the mortar. Strawberry realized that Mom really didn't put much effort into cracking the corn. She lifted the pestle a little ways and let it drop. Lift and drop, lift and drop. She let the pestle do the work. Little Bird didn't think she'd ever been hungrier and couldn't wait to eat. They'd had a big supper when they got to the fields, which clearly wasn't enough to hold her until breakfast. She helped Mom mix the cornmeal with hot water and dried blueberries, making dough for boiled bread. They formed the dough into little round cakes and dropped them into the simmering pot of stew when it was just about done. Finally, breakfast was ready. Little Bird waited patiently, helping Mom serve bowls of stew and boiled bread to Grandma and Grandpa and to her dad. Then Mom gave Little Bird and Strawberry their breakfast before making a dish for herself. No one started eating until a prayer of thanks was given to the corn, the beans, the water, the blueberries, which was hot and satisfying on a cool spring morning. Into the cedar swamp. After breakfast, Strong Bear and his brother Tall Pine met with a group of men. They were deciding who would go into Cedar Swamp to gather saplings for the house frames that needed repair, and who would begin burning over the cornfields, getting them ready for planting. Strong Bear went with the men to the swamp. The one nearest them extended over such a huge area that people from several villages harvested from it. The people had built their homes of cedar poles for centuries, knowing that the time to harvest was in the spring when the sap rose in the trees. This is what allowed the poles to be bent into the house frames without breaking. Upon entering the swamp, the men chose the area to begin cutting. First and foremost, they offered prayers, thanking the trees for the gift of their lives so the people could build homes. They also showed respect by cutting in a way that encouraged the growth of new saplings. The men tended the areas they cut so that the conditions in the swamp were ideal for the trees to flourish. Swamp cedar grows tall and straight with most branches near the tops of the trees. The limbs and seed cones were trimmed off and left to produce new saplings. The cut poles could be 30 feet long or more. When the men brought them back to the planting sites, they were put in the river to keep them subtle and bendable. The first job was to peel the bark off, and everyone, even some of the little kids, pitched in to help. This kept bugs from burrowing into the frames of the houses, and the bark itself had many uses. The outer bark was separated from the smooth inner layer and used as tinder to start fires. The inner bark became lashing for the house frames, mats for the floors, and also baskets. A complete brand new frame could be built in a day. Although Smiling Dove's house only needed new lashings in some spots to hold the frame together, the house really didn't need much work after the winter. No parts of the trees were ever wasted. Cedar, like tobacco, is a sacred plant, and the leaves were used in ceremony. Burning the fields. Tall Pine and his family lived near Strong Bear in the next cornfield over. He met with some of the other men to begin the plan for burning and clearing the fields, including those that would lie fallow and not be planted this year. This was done in spring and fall. The ashes were worked back into the mounds, enriching the soil to help the corn and other vegetables grow. When ready for planting, the fields looked like a grid of foot-high hills spaced evenly apart, stretching as far as the eye could see. This was such a good time of year. Each family had a large planting field, about an acre or more for their corn. Everyone helped in all of the gardens. Men, women, and children worked together, sometimes singing, always laughing. The women cooked lots of food, and everyone would take a break and sit in the shade to have a meal. People always carried their own bowl and spoon for just such occasions. Cleanup for 100 people was easy, as everyone washed their own dishes after they ate. Herring peepers, herring time. Everyone checked the river every day, watching for the herring to come up on their spawning runs. The people used them for food and also for fertilizer in the gardens. The herring peepers, little frogs who emerged from their muddy winter hibernation in early spring, had been heard for weeks now. Little Bird and her dad spent many evenings sitting quietly and listening to the comforting rhythm of their chirping chorus, carrying the promise of spring. Strawberry could never figure out how the herring knew which river to come back up to the pond they were born in. Little Bird explained this to her every year, but so far it was still a big mystery. Strawberry would soon be 6, so maybe this was the year that she would come to this understanding. Everyone learns in their own time. Little Bird noticed, however, that Strawberry had no trouble understanding when the herring were roasted and juicy over the fire. She was already adept at removing the many bones, so she didn't choke as she swallowed tender morsels of her fish dinner. She wanted to be just like her dad and her grandpas, who could eat and maneuver the bones out the sides of their mouth into wondrous, woven net-looking things. The herring, being so bony, was the reason they made good fertilizer for the corn mounds. When they were running heavily, the men would collect them with dip nets and carry basketfuls to the cornfields. Of course, this was always done with proper ceremony, acknowledging the fish that were giving up their lives so everyone could grow their corn. Fertilizing was not done every year, but only when the soil needed it. Otherwise, only enough herring for food was caught. The men worked very hard with the river. They cleared fallen branches from certain places so the water could flow freely, but they left brush in other places so the fish could rest there, hidden from hawk view. The men also helped in the gardens, digging holes for the fish fertilizer with stone-bladed hoes, then hilling the earth into mounds. Smiling Dove's fields didn't need fertilizer this year, and Little Bird and Strawberry didn't mind not having to handle the slippery fish. Putting 2 fish in each hole in the entire garden took hundreds of fish. That was a lot of slipperiness to then hill the mounds up over. Actually, Little Bird didn't even mind this work. Preparing the garden was very pleasant in the spring sunshine and gentle breezes. She loved the feeling of working with her hands in the warm earth, like being home, connected, knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Corn Mother, planting time. Smiling Dove, along with Little Bird and Strawberry, met with the women from all the other families. The clan mothers gathered them together to organize the spring planting ceremonies. The women's connection to the corn was honored, as both are female spirits. The corn, beans, squashes, pumpkins, melons, and sunflowers are acknowledged and given thanks for the food and nourishment that they provide. Their lives make it possible for ours to continue. During the ceremonies, Little Bird always looked forward to hearing her grandma sing all of the different songs. She had a deep, rich voice, and Little Bird, especially when she was smaller, would sit in her lap, resting her head against Grandma's chest. She could feel the song resonating, like it was rising right out of Grandma's heart. Sometimes an eagle or a hawk would fly overhead, shrilling in compliment to the ladies singing. The day of the new moon had come, and people had been watching for signs that it was safe to plant. When the shadbush blooms and the leaves of the oak were the size of a mouse's ear, there would be no more frost. The ground was warm and ready to bring forth new life. It was time to plant. Everyone's field only took a day or so to plant, as the women and children all helped each other. Planting sticks made small holes in the tops of each mound, and 4 kernels of corn were dropped in. A swipe of the foot covered soil over the hole, and the women could quickly get the seed into the ground. Of course, some people were still working on their aim with the corn seed. Little Bird had become pretty proficient at age 12 and hardly ever had to retrieve an overshot kernel. Little Strawberry, on the other hand, spent more time stooping and scooping the seeds that missed the holes than she did remaining upright. She had planted far fewer hills than the other girls. Little Bird could tell, though, that she was doing better than last year. She waited for her sister and saw that some girls were also purposefully going slower so that Strawberry would not feel bad because she was not as fast. After all, it is the learning and working together that matters, not a competition to see who's the fastest. This was something children learned from the time they were born. So now, after only a few days, everyone's corn had been set. The men had planted the tobacco gardens with the tiny seeds from last year's harvest. Tobacco was a very important plant. It was smoked socially when guests came in and was used in all ceremonies. The men had also repaired or rebuilt the corn watch towers in the middle of the fields. All the kids went to work then, sitting up there at dawn and again at dusk. Their job was to scare the birds and small animals away from digging up the seed or newly sprouted corn. They yelled and threw sticks at them, all the while worrying should they injure a little bird. Especially Little Bird. She was given that name when she was 3 because a tiny chickadee landed right on her toes when she was sitting outside one day. He perched on her foot for a while, eyeing her confidently as the little girl sat mesmerized. She slowly reached out, hoping he might hop on her hand, but off he flew to his next destination and away from the toddler's grasp. It always seemed to take forever for the baby corn to sprout through the soil. Seeing the tiny plants emerge from the earth as a result of your own work was such a good feeling. The kids all got very serious about their jobs in the corn watchtowers. The work was just beginning. When the corn plants were as tall as your hand from wrist to fingertips, it was time to plant the other vegetables, the beans, squashes, pumpkins, and also the melons and sunflowers. The many types of beans and squashes, pumpkins, and melons were planted in the mounds with the corn. Sunflowers were planted along the edges of the garden to stand like sentinels watching over the crops. While the different types of squashes were planted separately so they wouldn't mix, people didn't worry about the beans. They got planted together, stored together, cooked together, and the best part, eaten together. The beans seemed to know what they were doing. They always grew their own kind, even if 4 different ones were planted in the same mound. This was another mystery for Strawberry to ponder. But she carried on and helped the other girls, spacing 4 beans evenly around each mound, halfway down the sides. At the same time, 4 squash, pumpkin, and melon seeds, were planted around the base of each mound. Strawberry, well, all the kids, couldn't wait for the harvest, when the sweet, juicy pink melons would be ready to eat. So refreshing on a hot end of summer day. New Year's ceremonies. But it was a long ways from melon harvesting time. It was still spring, with plants flowering and trees sprouting tiny new green leaves. The soil in the garden was warm to small bare feet. The folks who had to build new house frames were finishing up the job now, fresh strips of cedar bark binding new poles together. Everyone's garden had been planted and was being carefully watched over. The first work of spring and summer was completed. It was time to prepare for the New Year's ceremonies. Here was one situation that was not a mystery to Strawberry. She already understood why spring was called the New Year. It made complete sense. There are new baby animals and birds. The herring come home to have their babies. The trees have brand new leaves. And all the plants and flowers come alive again and sprout from the earth after the long winter. Everything in the world is new in spring, so it's the new year. New Year was an important ceremony, with great gatherings of people from all over coming together to pray and give thanks to honor new life. After the ceremonies, there was feasting and visiting. It was a time when people gathered with friends and family they might not see very often. Everyone ate and sang and danced. There were dances and songs done only during ceremony, and after, those for the enjoyment of being together. The singers got everyone up and moving with the social dance songs. The singers each had 2 sticks carved with beautiful designs, keeping rhythm on a log or folded hides. Sometimes the singing and dancing went on all night. The aromas coming from the cook areas were overwhelmingly delicious, as huge feast kettles bubbled with soups and stews. Everyone brought food to cook, and some people had turkeys and geese roasting over the fires. Strawberry wished she could help cook, but she was still too little to stir the feast kettles. Even though she had grown a lot, she could barely see into the huge pots. Little Bird helped her Auntie Blue Heron pack a huge bass in a thick layer of clay. He was almost as long as Strawberry was tall. Uncle Tall Pine dug a pit in the other side of the outdoor kitchen and had been burning a fire in it since mid-afternoon. The wood had burned down to a large bed of glowing coals. Using heavy forked branches, he and Blue Heron carefully placed the clay-packed fish on the coals, moving quickly as the heat was so intense. They covered the fish with firewood, adding more as it burned down. It took an experienced fish baker to tell when the clay was dried through and the fish done. Other people dug pits on the beach, building huge fires, burning them down to the hottest coals. They collected rockweed, a seaweed that has little bubbles that contain seawater. Layers of rockweed went on the hot coals, making the bubbles release their water as steam. Lobsters, clams, quahogs, and mussels were piled on the rockweed, and more piled on top of them. Old mats were laid over the pits to hold the steam in as it cooked and flavored the food. For a while, Little Bird couldn't find Strawberry anywhere. She wasn't in the house. She wasn't with a group of children who divided their time between dancing and running around and playing. She wasn't in the corn watchtower. She wasn't with Auntie Blue Heron and her family. These cousins were already asleep back at their house. Finally, she could see her Uncle Tall Pine in the light of the fires. He was carrying Strawberry in his arms, and she was sound asleep. She had gone back to his house with those cousins, where climbing onto a bearskin on the bed cued her eyes that it was time for them to shut. Tall Pine laid Strawberry down on her own bed, covering her with Mom's favorite beaver fur robe. One Strawberry mystery solved. It had been a long, full, and wonderful day. Little Bird bid her uncle good night as they passed on the path. She was so tired she thought she might have to lie down right there for a nap so she would have enough energy to get home to bed. She could see the fire glowing in the house, but it may as well have been on the moon. This had been a great beginning of summer.